Hi there. So what do we mean when we call somebody right-wing? Well, I think that this can be quite confusing because often when we call somebody right-wing, we can be meaning very different things in different contexts. And sometimes people can be right-wing in some contexts and not right-wing in other contexts. In fact, even political parties like the Conservative Party in the UK or the Republican Party in the United States can be right-wing in some senses and they might be left-wing in other senses. Take, for example, in the UK, Nigel Farage is a figure on the right in British politics, and yet he has put forward recently some proposals that would typically be associated economically with the left because he's talked about nationalisation as a policy. So that's why it can be quite confusing, because sometimes figures who we regard as right-wing aren't consistently doing right-wing things. And the second reason it can be a bit confusing is that the expression right-wing or calling somebody right-wing can often be used as a term of abuse. And so sometimes, particularly people on the left or on the centre-left, can describe somebody or something as right-wing, not because they're trying to accurately describe it, but because they want to say that it's something they don't approve of or it's something they dislike. And often they'll be describing something that in fact is right-wing, but often they won't be. So let's start with trying to get to grips with this then. So I want to start by going back to the first use of this word, which was in the French Assembly during the French Revolution. And generally speaking, those that sat to the right of the speaker in the French Assembly were those that were supportive of the monarchy and of traditional institutions, whereas those that sat to the left were those that wanted radical transformation within society, including, in many cases, getting rid of the monarchy altogether. So you can see that the first meaning of the word right-wing is going to be a hostility towards radical or revolutionary change and a valuing of the status quo or tradition. So why is it that somebody who is right-wing, why is it that they might value the status quo and they might be sceptical of change? Well, I think it goes back to the idea that for people on the right, there's a worry that the cure that is put forward by the left might be worse than the disease. Whenever change is proposed, particularly radical and revolutionary change, there is always something to be lost, something that's going to be got rid of or overturned. So take the instance of getting rid of the monarchy. Somebody on the right will immediately want to ask, well, what about all of the things that we value about the monarchy? What about the fact that the monarchy has stood the test of time, that it serves a purpose within our society? And then what is going to replace the monarchy? Right? So there's skepticism about both getting rid of the institution because it serves a purpose, but there's also skepticism about any proposed solution to the problem. And this leads people who are on the right in politics to be sceptical of change. And where they do support change, they're going to prefer gradual, organic change. So that's the first meaning of right-wing that I want to put forward. So the second thing people are referring to when they talk about somebody being right-wing is their attitude towards the economy. Now, in general, if you're describing somebody as right-wing on the economy, what you're saying is that they want a thriving capitalist free market economy where the state is getting involved as little as possible, where there is a thriving private sector, where consumers have a wide degree of consumer choice, where taxes are low, and where the public sector, the activity of the state, and in other words, in providing things like healthcare and education, is limited. And the idea here is that in a thriving free market economy, there's going to be lots of private sector firms competing in a marketplace, and this is going to lead to competition, which is going to drive down prices for consumers. It's going to spur innovation, it's going to create jobs, and it's going to create economic growth. It is, for people on the right, how you create an opportunity economy. Now, most people on the right would acknowledge that this vision is going to come alongside some degree of inequality, maybe quite a lot of inequality. Now, some people on the right would be comfortable with that, and they would say, well, in a thriving free market economy, you need to have inequality because it is actually the inequality that creates the incentives for people to work hard. And they would describe the inequality that exists under capitalism as being a kind of meritocracy. In other words, if you work hard and you develop your skills within a free market, you're going to rise to the top of the social hierarchy. In other words, capitalism rewards hard work and effort. Whereas if you don't do that, you'll fall to the bottom. And that's kind of where you deserve to be. So I think a right-wing set of ideas can come across as quite kind of brutal when pushed to the extreme. But the idea behind it is that it's only by the state getting out of the way and allowing us to make choices within a free market that individuals can thrive and prosper. And the more the state gets in the way, the more the state creates problems. And it comes back to the idea, really, that for somebody on the right, the free market is the most efficient way of allocating goods and services within an economy. It does a much better job of the state at doing that. And it's better for the free market to do it because if you've got the state planning the economy, which used to be in vogue, it's going to require the state to put an awful lot of resource into central planning. And it's also going to create a larger state, which people on the right would worry would be a threat to our freedom. This is what Friedrich von Hayek is worried about in The Road to Serfdom, for example. So there we go. I think you've got the idea. If you're on the right, economically, you want a small state, free market economy. The third thing that people mean when they talk about right wing is people's attitudes towards social issues. Now here we've got a bit of a contrast with the previous thought, because in the previous thought I expressed, I was emphasizing the idea of individual freedom. But actually, a right-wing view on social issues is kind of the opposite of this, and it seems contradictory, because if we describe somebody as right-wing on social issues, what we're saying is that they actually want to restrict freedom because they think the state should have a clear role in setting moral standards within society, and the purpose of the state is to set very clear moral standards, often coming from religion. So in Europe, in the Western world, that would be Christianity, and saying these are the precepts you should live your life by, and it is up to the state to provide clear moral guidance and to punish wrongdoing so that people make better choices about their own lives. So this is kind of an authoritarian approach to social policy. It would lead to things like same-sex marriage not being legal, drugs being criminalised, in sexual ethics, restrictions on pornography, maybe restrictions on divorce and abortion, those sorts of things, okay? And the idea behind it, or the rationale behind it, is that for people on the right, if you just allow people to have freedom, liberty will turn into license. In other words, people will just do whatever the hell they want to do, and it will destroy what you might call the social fabric. And the final thing that you might mean when you describe somebody as right-wing is that they have quite a exclusive conception of what it means to be part of the nation, and that they are fiercely patriotic. So, for example, if I talk about this in the context of Britain, to have an exclusive concept of the nation, what I mean by that is you think that people coming into the country, recent immigrants, let's say first generation immigrants, you might have the view that they can never fully integrate into British society, and you might see too much immigration or immigration that is too fast as being a threat to the social order. That's kind of the position on the right. On the far right, of course, the politics of race come into it, and the ideas become a whole lot more ugly. But in general terms, if you're on the right, you're going to have a less inclusive form of national identity compared to people on the left. And you're also going to have a much more patriotic idea of your country, what it has stood for in the world, and you're going to see criticisms of, again, in the context of Britain, the British Empire, for example, as not just being threatening to your sense of what your country is about, but you might even feel it as a threat to your identity. And that's why we have so many so-called culture wars around, for example, Britain's role in the slave trade, whether the British Empire was a good thing in the world, because for people on the left, it just seems obvious that Britain's role in the world was negative. I say this as somebody on the left who's a critic of the British Empire. But of course, if you're on the right, you're going to view that criticism as not just an attack on your idea of history, but also it's kind of like an attack on who you are, on your identity, on your culture, and that's how they're going to see it, which is why the culture war debates get so animated and ugly. So that's kind of my 4 categories. So just to summarize, if you use the language right wing, you could be saying that you are skeptical of change and you value tradition. You could be saying that you would like a free market capitalist economy with a small state. You could be saying that you are conservative on social issues. In other words, you're more authoritarian leaning. Or you could be referring to somebody having a narrow idea of what the nation is and of being fiercely patriotic. Now, of course, it's quite unusual for somebody to be consistently right-wing in all 4 categories, and that is why ideology is so confusing. So that's all for now. I'm going to, in my next video, talk about what it means to be left-wing, and then if it's interesting to people, I think I might go into some of the political ideologies, liberalism, socialism, conservatism. Let me know what you think about that idea. But for now anyway, goodbye and best wishes.